As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So President Biden was in Israel on Wednesday for a brief visit, and the Times of London reported that privately President Biden expressed backing for a ground invasion of Gaza during talks with Netanyahu. The report said that Biden told Netanyahu that he remained fully in support of Israel's plan to launch a ground incursion to eliminate Hamas, despite all the outrage over the bombing of the Ali Arab Hospital in Gaza City that Israel is blaming on an errant Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket, and the U.S. is now backing Israel's side of the story. We'll get more into that in another article here. And Palestinian officials are still insisting it was an Israeli airstrike. So according to a report from Axios on the talks between Biden and Netanyahu, the primary message that Israeli officials expressed to President Biden was that the war in Gaza will take time and test U.S. support for Israel. So over 3,000 Palestinians have already been killed in Israel's onslaught of Gaza. The number is around 3,500 right now, and over 1,000 children, according to Gaza's health ministry. And that's since October 7th, so not very long, and already that many people are dead. So you have to imagine a ground invasion is going to incur huge casualties, huge civilian casualties as well. So an Israeli ground invasion of Gaza appeared imminent towards the end of last week. It's kind of seemed imminent right after the Hamas attack, but it never came. It still hasn't happened. And there's reports that I covered that said Israel is worried about Hezbollah opening up a second front in the north. And this is a big concern for escalation. You know, from our standpoint, the U.S. directly entering this thing, say Hezbollah launched a significant attack because there's still this fire going on the border. Hezbollah launched some strikes into Israel on Wednesday. Israel launched more into Lebanon. But that's what it has stayed at, kind of a volley of rocket fire, no major attacks. If there's a major Hezbollah attack, it seems like the U.S. is going to directly intervene. And then who knows what this thing could turn into. So this was on Wednesday. Brazil proposed a UN Security Council resolution that would have called for humanitarian pauses to allow the delivery of aid to Gaza. The U.S. was the only member of the Security Council to vote against the proposal, which is enough for a veto. If any of the permanent members vote against something, that's it. It vetoes it. So 9 out of 12 members voted in favor of the resolution, while the UK and Russia abstained. Russia abstained because they said this resolution did not call for a ceasefire strongly enough. But so this is what the U.S. is saying. So if you remember, I think I went over yesterday that the U.S. and its allies voted against a Russian proposed Security Council resolution for a ceasefire. And the reason that they did it is because it didn't condemn Hamas. At least that's what the U.S. said. Now the U.S. is complaining because this Brazilian resolution did condemn Hamas, and they still voted against it and vetoed it. Now the U.S. is complaining that it does not mention Israel's right of self-defense. So again, the UN security resolutions are kind of symbolic, but the fact that the U.S., this is typical of the U.S. covers for Israel at the UN, but I think it just, says a lot about the hypocrisy of the U.S. U.S. Central Command confirmed that 3 drones were fired at U.S. soldiers over 24 hours in Iraq. 2 drones were successfully intercepted, while 1 crashed and caused minor injuries to coalition forces. So on the same day of this drone attack, several of Iraq's Shia militias announced plans to coordinate support for Gaza. And in western Iraq, 2 drones targeted the Al-Assad airbase. American officials say the drones were intercepted and reported no casualties. That was initially. Now, at least they're saying that there were some injuries. And Kyle put a quote in here from Kateb Hezbollah last week. Now, it's not clear if they were the ones behind the drone attack, but they issued a warning that said, quote, "Our missiles, drones, and special forces are ready to direct qualitative strikes at the American enemy in its bases and disrupt its interests if it intervenes in this battle," end quote. So they're saying they'll, do more if the U.S. intervenes. And there was also a second militia that claimed to have targeted U.S. soldiers at the Al-Harir base in northern Iraq. And that was a statement issued by the Islamic Resistance in Iraq on Telegram. So this is definitely an area where things can heat up. So this isn't really a surprising poll, considering how things have gone, how the withdrawal went and everything. But it says that 2/3 say the American war in Afghanistan was not worth fighting, and most say the U.S. was unsuccessful in our foreign policy goals in Afghanistan. Only 22% say the U.S. was successful during the war in improving opportunities for Afghan women. 74% still view advancing the rights of Afghan women as an important policy goal. Less than a quarter say the U.S. was successful in achieving their other foreign policy goals, such as helping develop a functional Afghan government. Obviously, they didn't do that. Only 16% of people said that they did. 41% view Afghanistan as an enemy, and another 42% says it is unfriendly, while only 14% say it is an ally or a friendly nation. But definitely the interesting point here is that they do not, the majority, 2/3 of Americans think that the Afghan war was not worth fighting.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
2 days ago in Israel, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was asked by an American reporter if the United States military was strong enough and the United States arsenals were deep enough to supply Israel and Ukraine. His response was terrifying and terrifyingly ignorant. He said, "We can project power on both fronts." Is that the goal of United States foreign policy, to project power? Did he forget about Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq? Does he know what the hell he's talking about? How about we can project peace on both fronts? Sorry for raising my voice, but I'm...
Oh, what do you mean sorry for raising? People should raise their voice. Well, thank you.
But it just infuriated me that would be the essence of American foreign power. And it is factually wrong. We are not the strongest military on the planet. We don't have the workhorse of American military power, the 155 millimeter artillery shells, because we gave them all away to Ukraine. So he is historically and factually wrong. But they will continue to promote this myth of American superiority and American empire building because they think it'll help old Joe get reelected.
And then you talked about that guy Netanyahu in your article over here. And as I say, when all else fails, they take you to war. People forget. Week after week after week, month after month after month, 39 weeks in a row, the people in Israel were taking to the streets in protest of Netanyahu's Judicial Reform Act that took the power away from the courts and gave it to the politicians so he wouldn't be brought up on, go to the court because he's being brought up on charges.
Bribery charges.
And
I think that Netanyahu is at the end of his rope, which is one of the reasons he'll want to extend this war, because the Israelis will not change governments in the middle of a war.
Exactly.
But the blame on him and his government is widespread. The personal disgust with him as an Israeli leader is widespread. The understanding that the attack was either Israeli incompetence or Netanyahu indifference is widespread. It's hard for me to believe, and I get this from all my sources. I'm not just getting it from reading the New York Times. It's hard for me to believe that he survives beyond a month or so after the war. So he'll want to extend the war so that time doesn't come.
I want to read to you, this judge is when the Trends Journal used to be a quarterly. You ready? Crusades 2000. I wrote this in 2006. While the seeds of Crusades 2000 have been planted in full view of the world, and all those watching could have anticipated the eventual harvest, the memories of what had happened and what would occur have been fogged by rigid ideology, fanatical religiosity, patriotic fervor, government propaganda, and ulterior motives. When we first forecast Crusades 2000 over a decade ago, I did that in my book, Trends 2000, we wrote, quote, "The formal battle lines for the new crusade had been drawn when Israel was created in 1948. But Israel, however complex politically and militarily, was no more than the latest episode in a conflict going back more than 1,000 years. Regardless of what England's reason or intentions were, self-serving or otherwise, Crusades 2000 was set in motion by the 1917 Balfour Declaration that laid the foundation for Israel. Quote, you ready? His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object." We're telling you that this land is no longer going to be yours. We're the slimy English, the dirty British, where the sun never set on the British Empire. Oh, and His Majesty said, His Majesty, that doesn't piss or shit, that's well above everybody else, said, we're stealing this land from you.
That's effectively true. It's effective. What you're saying is historical fact, and that began the theft of the land, which culminated in the 1947-1948 time period, when the Jewish or the Zionist militias, engaged in thousands and thousands of acts of violence and forced 750,000 Palestinians from their homes, from their villages, and from their ancient land at the force of a gun. And then Harry Truman and the UN and the international community recognized the result of that and called it the State of Israel.
Well, Biden said it's a U.S. obligation to be involved in wars in Israel and Ukraine.
Correct. He did say that.
It's not my obligation.
No, he can't. It's indefensible, that statement. And I think most people know that, except the warmongers who are looking for every opportunity to shed somebody else's blood. And Lindsey Graham, as I said, is the prince among them.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
They murdered hundreds of non-combatants too. Men, women, and children, slaughtered them. Okay, that's what they did. And they did that in order to, quote unquote, make Netanyahu launch the giant attack that he has launched and has slaughtered, already hundreds and hundreds of civilians in the Gaza Strip as well in response. And as of, I'm not up on the latest news this afternoon, but the last I checked, they had not launched a ground invasion yet, but were preparing a massive ground invasion with the stated intention of completely obliterating the group Hamas off the face of the earth, which seems an impossible task to do with the civilian population of Gaza stuck in the middle there. But so then the purpose of that is quite literally, yes, to get their people, their quote unquote people killed, the Palestinian civilians of the Gaza Strip. That's why Hamas murdered the Israeli civilians, to force the Israeli government to launch this giant campaign that they know will kill civilians in the Gaza Strip, Palestinian civilians, men, women, and children too, in order to then provoke the counter reaction to that, right? This is what Saul Alinsky says in Rules for Radicals, that the action is in the reaction of the opposition. I learned that from William Norman Grigg, the Bircher. I'm not a communist. Thank you very much. But anyway, and he wasn't a communist either. He just knows his enemy. But look, the point is, Hamas has no power. Israel has all the power. It's 0 versus 1,000% power relationship there, right? These guys have AK-47s and shoes. The other side has essentially first world military technology to the nth degree. So Hamas can't defeat Israel in any kind of pitched battle. Well, certainly they can't invade Israel. They can fend them off, as we saw in 2014. Depending on just how far Israel's willing to go against them, of course. I'll tell you, my friend Mike, he said to me, he goes, you know what, Scott, here's what I don't understand. If Americans universally regret the way that the American Indians were treated and what had happened to them and essentially the obliteration of their civilizations off of this continent and the establishment of our civilization in its place. Well, how come nobody cares about this when it's happening right now? And I said, yeah, exactly. But, and here's the answer why. Because they don't know that. Because Ben Shapiro tells them that this is like Mexico attacking across the international border between Mexico and the United States, when that's a lie, and Ben Shapiro's a liar. This is like the Navajo attacking over the wall of the reservation. And if that happened, you would understand the power differential. And you would say, look, even if and I'm sorry I keep naming Indian tribes, I'm not trying to make anyone hate me. Let's say Brand X Indian tribe left the res and committed an atrocity. You would want to know what is going on there. And you would know it's probably that Hillary Clinton was mining uranium right under their town and got them all cancer, some horrible thing, right? You would know it was a real reason why, and that they were being treated unfairly, and that Uncle Sam Biden has all the power in the world, and they have none. And so it's on him to negotiate in good faith and figure it out, right? Not to say, oh, you did something wrong. We're bombing the reservation now. We're going to kill all your kids too. See how you like that. Can you imagine that happening now in America? It did happen before, and universally we regret it, that was the way the Indians were treated. Colonel Shivington said, nits make lice, men. Kill them all, the babies too. And that's our history that we hate and regret. And it's happening right now in front of our eyes, and we go, well, but the poor Israelis, but they're the 800-pound gorilla, and the Palestinians are their prisoners. Again, this is not to justify what Hamas did. What they did was evil. It's just to explain the deliberateness of the evil, why they would do it, and the position that they're in. And because, frankly, like, I know that most people don't know this stuff.
Establish the state. The UN then divides the area so that the Jewish people get some of it, but they got more than it seemed like their population entitled them to as compared to the people we call Palestinians. And then war breaks out, but war breaks out only in the areas that Jewish forces had moved into that they were not entitled to under the UN partition. And then we have the situation we have now that, then it was obviously modified a bit in 1967 and on down to the present. So my question is, what was the long-term plan here? What was the end game here? How was this supposed to work? Were we just going to, the special relationship with the United States didn't really begin until a little bit later, even though Harry Truman was very pro-Israel, but it only very gradually developed. Was the idea that, well, we'll just have the U.S. to just more or less bail us out forever? Like, is this how it's just supposed to go forever? In other words, did you think this through as to how this was ever going to work out in the long run?
I really don't know about that history nearly as well as a lot of, commentators on this. I would, definitely recommend people read Sheldon Richman's book. He does talk about how Ben-Gurion had sent his aide, I forgot the guy's name, to go and scope the place out. And the guy came back and said, we can't do it. There's people everywhere. We're going to have to figure out something else. And what they figured out to do was this ethnic cleansing campaign instead, to go ahead. And then they lied and said it was a land without people for a people without land. And it was a big cover-up, by the way. It was a big conspiracy theory that there were 800,000, 750,000 Palestinians cleansed from their land and that they were all huddled in refugee camps and all this stuff. That was crazy conspiracy talk. And in fact, Eric Margolis, the great journalist, his mother was this Lois Lane type running around doing independent, strong, feminine journalism or whatever after World War II, interviewing all these potentates in the region and everything. And she came home and reported about what was happening in the refugee camps after the cleansing. And they threatened to murder our friend Eric Margolis. They said, lady, we're going to kill your baby if you don't shut up about this stuff. Because that was a big conspiracy and a big cover-up that they had done that.
The Peter Schiff Show.
All this talk about inflation coming down, they forget that it's all cumulative. I mean, even if we went down to 2%, that's still 2% more than all of the previous increases combined. Nobody is talking about prices coming down so that we can actually reverse some of the increases. All they're talking about is slowing down the rate of increase. But prices will keep increasing from levels that are already substantially higher than they were a few years ago. But even the year-over-year increases that I'm seeing online now are 10% or 15% on top of everything else. So this is all a lie. In fact, I did this video. I've talked about it. You can still see this video on YouTube. And I did it in 2013. That's how long the government has been pulling off this con, trying to tell people that inflation is lower than it really is. And I'm going to mention it again because it's a good YouTube video. Just find it on my YouTube channel. I've got all these little pictures around it of the items. But what I did is I really dissected the CPI in that video, and I created a basket of actual goods and compared my basket to the government number, and prices rose. I forget double, triple what the government claimed. Now, my basket was consistent. I just grabbed 20 items and compared the prices over this 10-year period compared to the CPI. But one thing in particular that I remember exactly, I don't remember what the real numbers were on that comparison, but I did one particular category exactly, and that was newspapers and magazines. And the reason that I chose this one was because it was very easy for me to verify what newspapers and magazines cost in 2003, because I know I did it in 2013. And it was very easy because I just had to go online and find images of the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, Business Week, People Magazine, U.S. News and World Report, whatever. I picked like 20 magazines or whatever that were highly circulated magazines. And I just went back on the internet and I looked at the covers and I just saw the prices, right? They're written right there, right? And so then I compared the prices that were on the covers of those magazines in 2003 to the prices that were on the covers of the same newspapers and magazines in 2013, right? That's an honest way of doing it. I don't need any government formula. It's just look at the price. What was it 10 years ago? What is it now? How much did it go up? And when I did that, I saw a 130% increase in the price of those magazines and newspapers. But according to the official CPI, the total increase in newspaper magazine prices over the 10-year period was just 30%. 30%. But the actual increase, as confirmed by the magazines themselves, was 130%. So 100% was missing, right? It went into the CPI, but it never came out, thanks to the magic of the CPI. So obviously, if the government is underreporting how much prices are going up, then the retail sales are actually capturing the real increase in prices because it's what the consumers are actually paying. It's not what the government is pretending they're actually paying, but what they are in fact paying. And so these retail sales numbers are probably a better reflection of inflation than the CPI. And that's why the number is going up. It's going up because of inflation. So we're not going to celebrate this. This is bad news. Debt is driving a lot of these retail sales. And so again, it's not a measure of economic strength. It's economic profligacy. And the fact that Americans are spending is not something that we should applaud. It's an embarrassment. We're a bunch of kids, like profligate spenders that are just out there going on a shopping spree, right? There is no comparative advantage in reckless, irresponsible behavior. That's what we're doing. And all of this has been fed by our economic policy, our monetary and fiscal policy, because once upon a time, we were a nation of frugal savers. We had a high savings rate, right? We were responsible. Are we supposedly a better nation now that we're reckless and irresponsible? The fact that we don't save and the fact that we buy stuff that we can't afford, right? No, we were a much better nation in the past when we acted fiscally responsibly and when we had the discipline to delay gratification. It wasn't all about now. I have to indulge every desire I have right now. We were able to hold off. We were able to refrain from spending and delay that gratification to a later day. That's how adults behave. And now we're a bunch of reckless kids, which again is like, when you're talking about spending and saying, hey, that's the key to economic success. It's like saying that the reason a family is successful is because the kids spend money. No, it's because the parents earn the money. That's what's driving the household. Take the parents out of the equation and the kids are going to starve, or they're not going to be able to buy anything. The only reason they can buy is because their parents are out there working 3, 4, 5 jobs, right? So it's the work that's important. That's the locomotive, right? That's what drives the economic train. Everything else follows through. The spending is the reward, right? It's what you get as a consequence, as a result of your production. But we put the cart before the horse. We've got it backwards. And we're going to end up suffering the consequences very soon for that profligacy.
Kick it off first with this great statement from James Madison in a letter to Thomas Jefferson. He pointed out that perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged to provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad. Madison understood, Jefferson and many others understood, that the more powerful the state was, the more powerful the central government was, and it grew in its power most in a state of war, the worse things would be at home. You'd lose liberty in many, many ways. And I think one of the great examples we have, of course, is a nationalized police state in various ways. I want to talk about that briefly. Hear from John Whitehead in an article he published last week, Guns for Hire, America's Crisis State Goes Global. And he points out the military-industrial complex, which has established itself as the solution to all of our worldly problems at taxpayer expense, of course, he writes, has mired the nation in endless wars abroad waged by U.S. military service people who have been reduced to little more than guns for hire. This is the worst way to treat people who sign up to be part of the military, is to abuse and abuse them in ways that are not authorized by the Constitution. So if you want to respect and support the troops, you want to bring them home. That's a quick side note. But he says every successive president, starting with FDR, and I think you can go further back, has been bought, lock, stock, and barrel, and made to dance to the tune of the police state, a.k.a. the deep state, a.k.a. the military-industrial complex, and a.k.a. the surveillance state complex. And, of course, as Madison pointed out, and in many other areas he did the same, when you have that war abroad, you end up with a form of war at home as well. And Whitehead puts it this way in another article. The war hawks' militarization of America, bringing home the spoils of war, that is, the military tanks, grenade launchers, Kevlar helmets, assault rifles, gas masks, ammo, battering rams, night vision binoculars, etc., and handing them over to local police, thereby turning America into a battlefield as well, is also a form of blowback against, well, the endless wars that we have. Heavy support, get this, from a certain senator in Delaware. Who was a senator in Delaware in 1984 that gave us federal equitable sharing civil asset forfeiture? Well, what a surprise. Well, it incentivizes prosecutors to bypass more stringent state asset forfeiture laws by moving cases to federal jurisdiction. So civil asset forfeiture is basically flipping due process on its head. Instead of being convicted of a crime and prove, well, if someone is merely suspected of committing a crime, if the cops or the DEA pull someone over, well, I don't know how often the DEA does it, but the cops do it for DEA, and then they call the DEA, they find someone with a bunch of cash on them, they say, well, this has got to be drug money, we're going to confiscate this, and then you have to prove it wasn't used in a crime to get your stuff back. And most people aren't able to afford that. Most of the asset forfeiture on a civil level is done in smaller amounts against people who really can't afford to defend themselves against the government. So the federal program, so a lot of states in response to this have started to restrict the process, saying you can't do this. You have to have at least a criminal conviction in many situations. But the federal program does an end run around this. It encourages law enforcement to act as federal agents, thus becoming part of a federal nationalized police state. And here from the report, through a process known as adoption, the federal government can prosecute the forfeiture case under federal law, even though there was initially no federal involvement in the investigation and seizure. If the forfeiture is successful, the feds split the proceeds with the local police. Through this program, state and local law enforcement agencies receive up to 80% of the take of the loot. So it's basically a ripoff plan. So let's say your state, New Mexico or Colorado or Ohio, decides to end civil asset forfeiture under state law. What we've seen, and this has happened heavily in California, California had some pretty good restrictions against civil asset forfeiture for many years. But there was a ton of civil asset forfeiture still happening because the police would do is that because they were restricted from doing it under state law, they would just claim that everything was a federal case. And because there's so many laws and regulations on the books, it's not hard to find some rule that someone has broken on a federal level. And they say, well, this is a federal case. They call their buddy in the ATF or the DEA or somewhere in the DOJ, and they say, hey, well, it looks like we got a federal case. Will you guys take this through adoption? They do. The locals still do all the work, and then they get 80% of the money. It's kind of a pretty good payoff for them when they would have gotten 0% in the first place. So civil asset forfeiture is pretty bad. Now, states can just opt out of the program. A number of them, 6 to 8, have taken big steps in moving in that direction. And I covered that in some detail in an episode just this August. Nullify the federal equitable sharing asset forfeiture program. There's nothing that requires the states to continue participating in this equitable sharing program that we got from, of course, 1984 with that senator from Delaware who now lives in the White House. Really nasty stuff that supports all kinds of sanctioned, legalized, well, I hate to use that term, but it's government robbery, really. States can catch bad guys without spending all this time, money, and energy helping the largest government in history continue to violate the Constitution every single day of the year. And number 5 is get out of the prohibition in business. I keep citing the war on drugs, but let's go with 2 of them. First of all, the ATF shouldn't exist. It's unconstitutional. The only thing it's authorized to do under the Constitution is disband. So every moment of every day that any law enforcement agency in the country, and they all do this, really, participate with the ATF, they are also violating their oath of office. They are also violating the Constitution, and those relationships need to be severed. That's what the Second Amendment Preservation Act, now in effect in Missouri, does. We're going to get a vote on a similar piece of legislation in Ohio this next month. It looks like that's House Bill 51. So as soon as you can sever that relationship with the ATF, you're moving things forward at least one step. And then the same goes for the DEA. The only thing the DEA is authorized to do under the Constitution is disband, but the ATF and the DEA, partners in crime, they aren't going to disband themselves. So it's up to the states to stop helping them violate your rights and the Constitution.
Of course, the questions are always out there, and we're always trying to sort it out and make sure that they're all telling us the truth. Yeah. And that's a job. That's a job and a half. You know why it's a real big job? Because sometimes they don't even know if they're telling the truth or not. Yeah. They're just paid propagandists, or they're driven by money, and then there's no other thing to discuss. But there is a lot of excitement in the Middle East, and it isn't just a little skirmish. According to the markets are reacting very strongly that this is not going to go away next week, and there's going to be problems, and it's not going to solve the problem of the budget. The budget, not only will they not solve it, they're going to make it a lot worse. They're going to spend a lot of money. Israel's demanding, money. They're learning from Ukraine. Zelensky comes in and demands, I want this and this, but he sort of lost favor with it. But the Israelis are used to getting a lot of money. Remember that deal they made back in the 1970s, I guess? Yep. And they have $4 billion automatic. They're on our payroll. So I think it's pretty interesting. It's not universal. The fighting to get a speaker in the House is in the news all the time because it shows the Republicans don't know what they're doing, and that's what a major part of the media wants the message to be. But there was just a message that just came out a while ago. It says U.S. lawmakers demand Biden declassify intelligence on Gaza hospital disaster. Well, that sounds good. I figured, how do you handle real important information like this? Because under times of legitimate wars, you know, there should be. But what we're doing so often is illegitimate. So if things happen, there's massacres and killing and fighting, they shouldn't even be doing so. All of that should be available to the people. The people demanding this are the progressives, the real far left progressives, and it's good that they're saying, introducing the idea because we want a little bit of clear up of all this information. So that's what I think is good about it. But it's also, you know, we're not looking for the progressives or the Democrats or whoever to have smooth sailing because they have control of the media. But I think this is an indication that the division in the Democratic Party probably is every bit as strong. But they always, so the Democrats, they give credit, they always at least get together, and after a few broken arms, they come along and stick together. And Republicans keep fighting. Yeah. And one of these days they'll have a speaker, but you know, that's one thing that doesn't keep me awake at night. When are we going to get a speaker? You know, what are we going to do? So, well, maybe that'll be resolved today. But there's another recourse we want to spend some time on. Biden gives Netanyahu private backing for Gaza. Once again, it has to do with intelligence gathering. Do we know what's going on? And this is big because what he does, according to the way I understand it, this could get out of control, especially if you start getting troops on the border and troops drawn into it, and where is the red line and when do they cross? And there's a lot of ducks lining up now on what's going to happen.
Well, the other big question about the Biden-Netanyahu meeting, and I don't know, perhaps I missed something, I read constantly, but what, if anything, did he tell Netanyahu about Hezbollah and the willingness of the U.S. or the interest in the U.S. of directly intervening militarily? Because we've talked about it, we have the 2 carrier strike groups, we have additional combat naval vessels there, we have probably 15,000 troops all told in the region. What has he told and what kind of promises has he made to Netanyahu about, will we go in? So the idea is, you know, if Israel commits a significant portion of its troops in the south to Gaza, that will leave the northern border open for a Hezbollah attack, and that's the concern. Did Biden reassure Netanyahu, hey, we got your back. If you're all in Gaza and Hezbollah comes down from Lebanon, we are going to go in full force, and we're going to go to war with Lebanon, with Hezbollah, which, as we know, is Iranian backed. So basically, we're going to go to war with Iran as well in your favor. Did he say that? And if he did say it, does he remember saying it? Did anyone record it? And that is the biggest issue, because that's the issue of World War III. You know, and we have a recording of Biden on Air Force One, and he was asked by a reporter. He said that the reporter asked him. She said, "The Times of Israel has reported that you have given them assurances that we will go in militarily." And he has a very succinct answer. He says very clearly, "That's not true. I never said that. I never said we would join the IDF in fighting Hezbollah." There have been contradictory reports as well. But for me, at least, I think that's the top question.
You know, one of the first foreign policy conflict that was going on that I got involved in when I went back into Congress had to do with Beirut. Remember?
That's right.
Remember, Beirut was, and that was under Reagan. And of course, Reagan has never done anything wrong. He was a very nice person. He was above many of the other ones we've had. But he did make a mistake. But I think he recognized that. I think even in his memoirs, he wrote about that was a big mistake on his part, and he took responsibility for it. But I remember there were some others on the Congress, probably more likely Democrats, maybe it was Dennis Kucinich or somebody, that we were going down every single day and doing 1 minute about get the troops out of Beirut. Yeah. And it was constant. And that was, I remember Barry Goldwater Sr. was involved in that. I even wrote him a note and corresponded with him. Why? And yet the whole thing blew up. Can you imagine? The Marines didn't even have ammunition.
Yeah. Crazy.
So that was a tough lesson, but that lesson should be learned just by looking at history and what happens, and a little bit about human nature, and look at how liberty really works. But this kind of stuff that goes on, we're back in Lebanon, and you know, Hezbollah, I think, is a little stronger now than it was back then. I don't think they weren't throwing that word around nearly like they are now. So it's a mess over there for sure.